We're very happy to be here with you tonight. Welcome to our virtual event tonight with Rick Telander and Joe Bonomo for a discussion of great baseball writing. Just a few short housekeeping things before we begin and as everyone's filtering into the room. As you're watching this conversation, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We are monitoring that for questions at the end, and we may contact you via chat to ask your question yourself. Then and only then should you raise your hand to speak. If you don't yet have a copy of the author's books, you can get them from the links that will drop into the chat as we go along. My name's Allison Sansoni, and I'm the program director at the American Writers Museum. If you like the kinds of online programs you're seeing from us, you can become a member and get advance notice of special programs and offers, including book clubs, literary trivia, behind-the-scenes virtual tours, and lots of good things to keep you busy during this very strange time. Our YouTube channel, American Writers Museum, has videos posted of programs from the past several years. You can check that as well for news and updates. Last week's live broadcast of The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass is now available. Our book-selling partner, when we're both here open and here online, is Seminary Co-op Bookstore, and you can order online from them or from our bookshop.org page as well. We're grateful to all of you for being here and for valuing the past, present, and future of thoughtful reading and writing. Tonight, we welcome essayist Joe Bonomo and sports writer Rick Telander to talk with the AWM storyteller Courtney Borges about their favorite baseball writing and writers. Joe is the author of No Place I Would Rather Be, Roger Angell and a Life in Baseball Writing, as well as numerous books of essays. Rick is a 3-time Pulitzer nominee and the senior sports columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times.
Hopefully, first of all, I want to say to both Joe and Rick, again, thank you so much for joining us here for this conversation. It is a real privilege to talk to both of you, and it's also very exciting to be able to talk about baseball right now in the absence of baseball, physically right now. So it's a really nice way to just remember a time of baseball right now. And I want to just get you guys started by just asking a little bit about your background, in particular, what drew you to baseball writing, either something that, influenced you to start writing toward baseball as an enthusiastic reader of baseball literature or particular sports writer. I would love to hear how this love and passion of baseball writing came into your life.
Well, I can start. I'm not sure Rick can hear us. I'm actually not a sports writer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm an essayist. I've been writing essays for a long time, but I've been a baseball fan my entire life, ever since I was a teenager. And one day when I was a late teen, I guess, or maybe a little bit later than that, I noticed a book by Roger Angell on my dad's bookshelf called Late Innings. I took it down, I started reading it. I just fell in love with Angell's style, with his approach, with his sort of a literary approach and sensibility to baseball writing. And I loved it from the beginning before I could really sort of make sense of it or even be able to articulate why I loved it so much. But I kept up reading Angell regularly, as so many of us have, through all of his annual pieces and his decades worth of writing. And a few years ago, I decided that his story would be a great story to tell. That he is really, there's no one quite like Roger Angell when it comes to baseball writers. And I felt that a book was deserved. So I pitched the idea to him. And he was enthusiastic once I made it clear that I wasn't interested in writing sort of a conventional biography, because he didn't want that done. And luckily, that wasn't the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book about his career and specifically about his writing. And he was very enthusiastic after that. And I learned afterwards that the Baseball Hall of Fame houses 60 plus boxes of his writings and drafts and box scores and notes going back for decades. So I visited the Hall of Fame for a few days and did some research there, and that really got the ball rolling.
I'll ask you, Joe. I mean, you made a great point about the style of Roger Angell. I was wondering if you could go into more detail too about what are some of his strengths? I mean, he is a prolific sports writer that has been working for decades in baseball, and that is a testament to his talent. So I was wondering if you could go more in detail about, what exactly about Rogers Angel's writing talent has been so prolific throughout,
Yeah,
his entire career.
sure. Yeah. Well, let's face it. He's a gifted writer. And he's a master stylist on the level of the sentence and the paragraph. And we're just lucky, baseball fans or writers in general, I think, that he found his subject and that his subject is baseball. We have to remember it took him a while to find his subject. He didn't start writing about baseball until 1962, when his then editor, William Shawn of the New Yorker, and the two of them sort of concocted this idea that maybe Roger would go down to spring training and watch the New York Mets in their first season in 1962 and see what he could come up with and write. And it turns out that Angel found his subject in baseball. He'd been a fan, of course, since he was a teenager. He saw Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth hit back-to-back home runs in the Yankee Stadium. That's how long Roger Angel's been a fan of baseball. No one has a through line like him when it comes to baseball. It's amazing. But I think the other thing we have to recognize, besides, a couple things. One, before he wrote about baseball, he was a short story writer. And he published a collection of short stories in 1960. And he had been publishing them mostly in the New Yorker magazine and other places for about 10 years or so. And then he eventually stopped writing short fiction, but he clearly brings a fiction writer's eye and ear and sensibility to writing about baseball. No one can write an at-bat or can describe an at-bat quite like Roger Angel. So I think he brought to bear a fiction writer's sort of sensibility for scene and for character, but also to recognize, I think, what might be a larger theme in what it is he's writing. I mean, he's writing about baseball, but he's also writing about something greater. He's writing about being alive and being a fan and belonging to something and feel like you're a member of a community. And there's a through line of sort of identifying baseball players as sort of members of an extended family. So that was also kind of one of the larger themes he writes about. So there's that. But the other thing, and a big factor, I think, is the magazine where he ended up. The New Yorker, when Roger Angel started writing in the 60s and into the 70s and 80s, was, as it is now, a weekly magazine, but it was 100 pages or more every week. And it's hard to imagine that thick of a magazine, coming to your house every week. And William Shawn, Angel's first editor, gave him famously, and all of his writers, essentially as much room as they wanted or as they needed to write, with very, very soft deadlines. Eventually, Roger sort of settled down to writing a spring training piece, and then a sort of a midsummer piece, and then a piece in the fall that summarized the playoffs and the postseason. But inside of these essays, he would go on for 20, 30, or 40 pages, and that, I think, is really what made Roger Angel special. Not just his native gifts as a writer and a storyteller, not just that he's a knowledgeable fan of baseball, but that he had the room to explore, as long as he wanted, anything and all aspects of baseball, anything that he found curious and that he found interesting and sort of worth exploring. And also when Shawn sent him down to the spring training in 1962, he gave him a piece of great advice. It's been quoted variously, but essentially Shawn said to him, don't be sentimental, and don't be cynical, which is great advice for a writer, great advice for a human being, probably. And I think that Angel, who's a natural skeptic anyway, and he very much resists sentimentality, or goo, as he calls it, he spent his career sort of writing between those two poles, being careful not to veer into sentimentality and sort of sap. And at the same time, pulling away from being cynical or mean-spirited or perhaps bitter about a sport that, let's face it, we don't need to look at today's headlines to that it's ongoing. The way that the sport has turned off fans and has rankled fans in the past. But Roger Angel, to his great credit, has always been able to plug himself into the game in such a way that always renews it for him. One of the words that he always uses from the very beginning, his first piece to his Hall of Fame induction speech for the Frick Award a couple years back, is variations of the word startled. He's often still, at his age and after this many decades, startled by things in the game. And that gives his writing a kind of a freshness and a boyishness, for want of a better word, that I think allows him to allow the game, that is, to kind of renew him on a daily basis. So that all is part of, I think, what's so wonderful about his style and his approach.
Definitely, definitely. I think it's a wonderful point too. Kind of related. I mean, baseball is kind of like its own genre of writing. That's not to say that other sports don't have magnificent and wonderful, thought-provoking pieces, but there is something about the sport of baseball that has captured writers and readers so elegantly and leads itself to some beautiful prose and poetry. Do you have, why do you believe baseball is able to invoke this language and such writers and readers like Roger Angel?
That's an age-old question, isn't it? People have often asked that about the game, and Angel himself has been asked. And you're right that, of course, football and tennis and basketball, they've also encouraged some fantastic, memorable writing down the decades. But there's something about baseball, and this is probably amusing to mention now, given that so many people are critical of the pace of play in baseball, that it's a game that drags on too long, et cetera, for our current attention span and all that. But that is one of the beauties of baseball, of course, that it's played without a clock. That is played, theoretically, any game can last forever. Eventually called, anyway, you pick it up 12 hours later, whatever it takes. But theoretically, a game can last forever. And so that means there's a lot that is going on, but also a lot that isn't going on. In any other sport, football, basketball, hockey, tennis, soccer, the ball is always moving. It's always in action. That's not the case in baseball. Some people complain about that. That's one of the things I love about the game. But that means that there's a lot of downtime. And even sometimes, as Angels mentions or acknowledges many times in his career, you even get bored sometimes at a baseball game, and that's okay. A game can be dull, but not boring in the sense that there isn't something to pay attention to. And I think with all of these spaces in the game where there is no action or where things aren't happening, I think the brain just naturally goes in and fills that space, and by definition sort of wonders and is curious, and the imagination is brought to bear, and memories come up floating in the between innings or during a pitching change of a game you saw when you were 12 or something like that. And one of the things Roger often uses in his writings, the idea of things being virtually visible in the game, like transparencies laid upon the game. Baseball especially encourages that feeling of connection to other games you've been to. And I think that engages the imagination, engages memory, and it maybe engages, for certain writers, a literary impulse, I guess, to explore the game in its kind of slowness that way. It's kind of slow baked quality, which is one of the things we love about the game.
Definitely. It's a good point too. Just in that way with baseball, not only just harkens back, I mean, it's such, his baseball has been going on for centuries now. It is a sport enriched in history that is going on decade, but connects fan to fan to fan. I mean, you hear people talk about generations of my grandfather, my mother, and now I am a fan. And it's just really this wholesome, connective, sense of community, which I think also lends really well into writing. It's just that it is something that we all share together, whether we're in the stands or just, talking one-on-one. It doesn't even matter. You could come from one different walk of life with one team in, the 50s and nowadays, and there will be something that connects you no matter what. You will find that ground somewhere in baseball.
Yeah, and that's, I think I mentioned earlier, that's something about the game that Roger found especially, he has great affection for, is that sort of, what, like you said, the generational aspect of the game, parents passing it to their children, et cetera. But also, as I said, he has often sort of identified players as kind of extended members of his family. And oftentimes, truth be told, the owners as sort of cranky fathers who maybe are antagonistic toward their own kids for various reasons. But that's sort of a side thing. But he recognizes family resemblances in his own experience and in all of our experiences as being members of a family. He sees resemblances or correspondences with that in baseball teams and players. Now, at one point I would say a recent essay, but in Roger's case, probably 20 years ago, he mentioned, it might have been even earlier. I think it might have been actually on the occasion of Thurman Munson's tragic death in 1979. Roger wrote about that a few months later, and he said something along the lines of, I think I have friends. I have more friends among baseball players than I do in my own private life at this point. And he was, I think probably pushing 60 or maybe 70 when he wrote those words, which is a pretty profound thing for a man of his age to say. But it goes a long way, I think, to identifying that affection that Roger has for the familial aspect of baseball, not just among the players, but also he writes about baseball parks and stadiums themselves as being like old relatives, old creaky relatives, and baseball players sort of acting like cousins that come to visit once every couple of years. This is back in the day when there were fewer teams and you didn't see so many teams so often. That great sort of feeling of family identification in the sport is something that Roger cares very deeply about, and is frankly one of the more personal aspects of his writing, and I think also autobiographical aspects of his writing too.
That's for sure. It's a good point too about how these stadiums do feel very, like they're homes in a sense. I mean, you see whenever, and it comes out, we have a name change, we have new sponsorship, or we're adding something, and you get very passionate, responses from fans, either pro or against, and it's always rooted in, this is the way I'm used to it, and I'm not sure, or you know what, I'm all for introducing. And it's really, it really is that sort of sense of home and belonging. And I do really appreciate that personal, personification, personal aspect to baseball writing, which is, again, it's speaking to this sort of familiar sense. Looking at stats and numbers and everything is really fascinating, but I do like the approach too of somebody coming in and looking from a human approach. Who are these people behind the catcher's mitt, when they take off the baseball uniform at the end of the day?
What's interesting in Roger's case is that he was never a beat writer. He wasn't a journalist. He was as many people maybe do know or don't know, he was a fiction editor at the New Yorker for decades. And that was sort of his main gig. And he wrote about baseball sort of on the side, or that ultimately eclipsed his reputation rather than a fiction writer. But yeah, that's one of the things that Roger, what's amazing about him is he's been writing for so long and been a fan for so long that he's seen stadiums built and leveled and replaced again, and has really reckoned with that kind of sense of identification that we have with the park. One of my favorite things he ever wrote was in the early 60s when his beloved Polo Grounds was torn down, I think in 1964. And he wrote an absolutely beautiful passage I quote in the book about Polo Grounds as being, he equates it with a tenement building, and fans sort of sitting next to him in the stands as being similar to families and friends hanging out on the stoop of a tenement building in New York, and people leaning out of windows and yelling, and it's just a wonderful passage that kind of evokes that affection he has for parks, stadiums, and the fans in them as being sort of one giant family, or one sort of block in the neighborhood. It's really great.
I see here that Rick should be able to talk now. Rick, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
All right.
Yay. Success. I'm so glad, it would have been a travesty if we weren't able to get you, but I'm so glad that we have you here again. So I just want to welcome you again to our conversation. Thank you for joining us. And Rick, I'm just very curious if you can tell us more about how, you got your start into sports writing and baseball writing, what drew you to what you're doing today?
It's interesting. I didn't get to hear anything you guys have said earlier, so if I'm redundant or contradictory, just ignore it. But yeah, when I started out, when I was in grade school, high school, and then college, I was fascinated by writers. I always wanted to be a writer, not necessarily a sports writer. It just happens to be a means to actually get paid. So you can be a novelist, which I suppose is what I wanted to be, which is deep inside what maybe everybody wants to be, but you can be broke and, never get your book published. So I wanted to make a living at it. So one of the first books that I read that really intrigued me and really kind of set me on my way, helped anyway, was Roger Kahn's Boys of Summer. And as I just heard the end there, Joe talking about Roger Angel, I think, right? Talking about the Polo Grounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, correct. Well, the same thing. Roger Kahn made the Brooklyn Dodgers seem like this kind of sacred arc that you might seek. It was there for a moment and it's gone, and it moved to Los Angeles and it left wondrous Brooklyn, and it sparked my fascination with that whole part of New York City. I went on to write Heaven is a Playground, a basketball book, but it takes place in Brooklyn, and I'd say a good part of it is because of that. And Ebbets Field he made sound like, again, it was some sort of sacred place, even though it was in the midst of a neighborhood, but everything that was kind of sleazy and lowbrow, immigrants, fights, stuff like that, people yelling, screaming, from tenements, all those things. It sounded magical. And when I was writing Heaven is a Playground, it was funny because the manager, this little kid, he's 12 years old, great guy. But I said, well, ask some of the guys on the team. They were all 14, 15 years old. We travel around. We were called the Subway Stars. And I said, where does he live? And I had to give all these guys fake names. So his fake name was Pontiac Carr. So I said, where does Pontiac live? And they said, well, he lives in the Jackie Robinson Apartments. And his apartment is on first base. I mean, literally, I guess they thought right where Ebbets Field was. So that was kind of my start and fascination with baseball and the combination with writing.
Thank you. And Rick, I know too that, you have written about sports in general as well. So I was wondering, what are some unique challenges that the sport of baseball itself poses that perhaps other sports don't? And even Joe, I know how, you're not necessarily a baseball writer, but you picked up on what writing about baseball is perhaps different than music or any other sort of genre that you partake in.
Yeah, are you asking me? I'm sorry.
You can start off with you, Rick.
Well, thanks. All right, Courtney. Yeah, well, the difference, one of the main differences is, probably the biggest one, is there's more games than any other sport. There's 162 regular season games, and then the playoffs, I don't know how many there could possibly be, another 20 or so. So what happened today in a game is irrelevant tomorrow. I mean, you really, as a writer and as a player, you got to forget what just happened and move on with the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and that's not the case with so many other sports. Certainly, the NFL is the opposite. 1/10 the amount of games, 16 to 162. So each game is incredibly important. You have a whole week to, mull it over and dissect it and rip everybody who played badly and praise everybody who played well. Baseball, that's not the case.
Good point.
Yeah, I don't know that you're right that I don't consider myself a baseball writer. In fact, my book on Angel really isn't technically a book about baseball so much as it's a book about baseball writing. But of course, when you're such a fan of Angel as I am, and I'm objectively considering him for this book, everything I mentioned earlier about baseball as sort of a sport that invites the mind to wander in during the lulls and during the dull periods, all that is very much apparent, I think, in Roger's writing. But as far as difference in writing about baseball or writing about music, I don't really feel that there's much of a difference because I'm turned on so much by both of them. And so I'm less aware of the differences in writing about a rock and roll band or writing about a show versus writing about a baseball game, which I do on my blog often. I'm less aware of the differences in writing about those than I am in where they overlap. And that's just why am I curious enough about this to want to explore it? Why is it meaningful, or why does it matter to me and hopefully to someone else?
I was wondering, this is for both of you. I would love to hear your opinions on this, but to you, what are some key aspects of successful baseball writing? What do you take away? What are you looking for? What do you come across in either a piece that you're writing or a piece that you come across that someone else has written that really stands out to you, that goes, that tells you or invokes something in you that goes, this is an outstanding piece of baseball journalism?
Wow. Well, I guess I'll go first if, to alternate here. Baseball writing obviously has to be, I think, more lyrical than football or basketball writing. Again, there's so many more games. Hockey writing, different entirely. And with baseball, you really want to catch the best writing, I think, captures the ambiance around the game and the people at the game and the way the game is so different. You stand there, there's nothing happening most of the time. You take like a time lapse or take a photo every 1 second in a baseball game, and 99% of the shots will be nothing.
Same thing,
Yeah.
But it's beautiful. I remember going to Wrigley Field for the first time. Well, not the first time, but with my dad for the first time. And he was a nut about. He really liked a nice lawn. He wasn't a dictator about it, but he said, damn it, Rick, those broadleaf plants, got to get them. Got to get those dandelions, the crabgrass is not supposed to be here. Well, he saw the grass at Wrigley Field, and it was like, I thought his knees were going to buckle, So that's the kind of thing that baseball does to you, and to capture that, I think is, Joe certainly knows probably way more about it than I do, at least as far as a certain kind of baseball writing, but that's what I would say.
Speaking of dads, Rick, my dad was born and raised in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, so he lost the Dodgers, and he knows that pain very, very well.
Oh boy!
And then he moved his growing family to Washington D.C. suburbs, and then lost the Washington Senators. So he's had two teams taken from him. He remains a baseball fan to this day. So I think one of the things that I like most in the baseball writers I like, Roger Kahn certainly, Boys of Summer, although he got a little bit, I think, to my taste, a little bit programmatic and kind of sentimental later on. And that's what I like the most in baseball writing is a kind of a skepticism, I think, a resistance to writing about baseball as this maudlin sort of grand old game that's America's pastime. It is, of course, but it's also full of scoundrels and fascinating people and a lot of humor and a lot of coarse humor. And my favorite writers, starting with Red Smith, who was a big influence on Roger Angell, who he wrote about. He was dry. He was funny, but he was dryly funny. He was humorous, but he was dry about it. And he was skeptical of some of the players and of some of the owners and umpires. And Mike Shropshire, another baseball writer I loved, wrote about the Texas Rangers in the 1970s. And some current writers I really like, Dan Epstein and Josh Wilker and others, write about baseball with sentiment, with feeling, but not with sentimentality, and not with this sort of maudlin approach to it, to the game. And so I think that kind of affection for baseball writing that's leavened with a bit of skepticism, I think, is what I admire most in I think probably all sports writing, but in baseball writing for sure.
Well, that is a great lead into perhaps my next question is would love to hear if you guys would have specific either stories or pieces or articles or what have you of your favorite baseball writing or something that you just think is very critical and influential, significant for, say, if you were a baseball fan and looking to study or read some powerful, moving baseball writing. If you guys have any suggestions or your favorites that you just would have to tell someone, like, this is the one you should check out. Can you see me? Am I on camera?
Unfortunately,
we can hear you, but we can't see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, it's a pity you can't see behind me because books are my brain. And so to get rid of them would be like giving myself a lobotomy. I honestly, seriously, I have a couple thousand, and they go all the way back, and I have a whole sports section. I have all these baseball books, Robert Coover. It's hard to pick one or the other. Even like Veck, as in Wreck, about Bill Veck, was just amazing. Talk about a scoundrel. Ball four. Ball 4 by Jim Bouton kind of changed everything. Everything about the sanctity of the locker room, the sanctity of whatever it might be, the boardroom or any place that anybody might be, where, it happened to be sports, but all of a sudden it became like, oh, geez, what I thought was private, maybe it isn't. And, so I enjoyed reading Ball 4, but I think also as I read it, and Bowden, not a great author. I'm not sure I guess it's his name on there. I'm not sure. There's a number of books. Is it? I'm sorry, Joe. Is it?
Yeah. It is.
Okay. He's the author. Well, yeah, I'm sorry, but I read that with, it's like this kind of voyeuristic and almost titillation. It was wrong to speak. Oh my God, I bet these guys don't want what you're just saying about them to be made public. I bet they didn't. And in fact, they really didn't. The Yankees really, really didn't. But it was truly a peek into the beginning of that kind of writing, and I'll say nonfiction writing at least, that pervades baseball writing to this day. All sports writing, all writing, everything. I mean, we got something coming out about Donald Trump written by his niece. It's going to be juicy, I hope. But, that kind of preceded all the stuff. And you have so much time in the clubhouse, in the locker room, and preparing to play the damn game, which is day after day after day after day. I don't know. I would agree with Joe. I don't like people who worship at the church of baseball. But, it does take place in the sunshine. There's something to be said for that.
Which it should anyway. I mentioned the writer Mike Shropshire. The Jim Bouton books, I think, preceded his books by a couple of years, but he's writing at that same sort of Bouton tradition of this sort of wry, cranky, very kind of smart alecky approach to covering baseball. He covered some pretty lousy Texas Rangers teams in the 70s. One book's called The Real Season, and the other is called The Last Real Season, I think. I'm not quite sure if I'm getting the titles right. But if you like that Bouton kind of irreverent writing, Shropshire was one of the best. Very, very, very funny, but also very, very smart about the game, but was careful not to write about it in an worshipful sense. I would recommend Shropshire. And of course, I recommend Angel, the greatest living baseball writer, without a doubt. But I'm often asked what my favorite Angel piece is, and I don't really have one because they're all so uniformly good. I know I sound like a gushing fan when I say that, but I say it with all the objective criticism. He rarely wrote or published anyway a weak piece, and in part because he spent so much time on them and had such soft deadlines and didn't have that kind of weekly or daily news bag that Rick knows so much about. But it allowed him this kind of expansiveness to be able to really, really craft his pieces. But I would say my favorite Angel book is Late Innings, the one I mentioned that I saw on my dad's bookshelf when I was younger. Mostly because I came of age as a baseball fan in the mid 70s and late 70s and into my teen years, as so many people do. You love the game when you're a 12-year-old and 13-year-old. And so I really, really loved baseball. I love it now, but I really grew to love it in those years. Those crazy Yankees Dodgers World Series and the Yankees Royals playoff games. And so Roger's writing about those years happen to be collected in his book Late Innings. So that's my favorite, but I would recommend all of his books really because they span so much time, and he's such a kind of a cultural barometer for the game because he's been a fan since the Depression era, if you can believe it.
Joe, you just brought up Kenneth Shropshire. I hadn't thought of him in a long, long time. I just went to my bookshelf. Can't watch me, but I did. And I have a book by him. I'm sure you've never seen it. It's called Agents of Opportunity, Sports Agents and Corruption in Collegiate Athletes or Athletics. Sorry. And I read it a long time ago, and I've forgotten his bio. Geez, maybe this is why you like his writing. Kenneth Shropshire is assistant professor of legal studies at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a practicing attorney on legal and business issues. He attended Stanford University on a football scholarship, received his JD degree from Columbia, was an assistant vice president with the Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee, and managed the 1984 Olympic boxing competition. So that's a lot that this dude had accomplished. And this book came out a long time ago. So he's had a lot of time to burn his polyfat apple too. So you're not dealing with a dumb guy. This book came out in 1990. So there you go. There's kind of Shropshire for you folks.
I think that Shropshire is a different one than the one I'm talking about.
Oh no!
Yeah,
really?
I was talking about Mike Shropshire. Unless I'm getting, I don't have my books.
Oh,
I haven't
how
pulled it
many
off.
people are named Shropshire in this
Yeah,
world?
what do you know, right? Yeah. I don't think that your Shropshire's bona fides were at the
Okay.
other.
All right, my bad. Sorry.
Not at all.
Oh.
Well, I was wondering too if, baseball, if you think, again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, baseball is so enriched in history, which also means that it is a sport that has evolved along the way. It's changed so much that it's accepted, and it's continued to change. And as baseball changes, so does baseball writing. I was wondering if you had any opinions or any thoughts as to how you see baseball writing going in the future.
Well, okay, I guess if I start again. Now, if we're talking about fiction writing and nonfiction, I mean, two very different things, because if you bring journalism into this, the whole world of journalism is, God knows where it's going. I mean, we might not have newspapers per se in 10 years, even though I've worked for one for 25. I really believe that. And this COVID thing has just speeded that up. Newspapers are now yesterday's news. That's what they are. They close at 10 o'clock at night, 11 maybe at the latest, and everything's got to be written by then. So whatever might happen, a riot or anything else, you're not going to read about it, so you go online. But we actually here in Chicago have, or had, if there was ever any baseball, two very good baseball writers. And one is Paul Sullivan, and the other is Gordon Wittenmeyer. And both these guys should be in the Hall of Fame. I got to tell you one thing about journalism, baseball, the Hall of Fame. Chicago, if you go to the press box at Wrigley Field, they have in the eating area, they have all these plaques of the photos of these the Hall of Fame writers, baseball writers from Chicago. And I think there's 10 or 12 of them. And the last one to go in, I believe, was Jerome Holtzman 20 years ago, at least. Mm-hmm. It's like baseball writing. It didn't, and all these other guys got in the 30 years preceding that. And I'm thinking, well, what about everybody in Cooperstown? Did they decide that Chicago baseball writing suddenly isn't any good anymore? So that really ticks me off, I got to tell you, because if you read what they write, it's very good. As far as baseball as a trope, as a theme for fiction writing, you never know. Something's going to pop out, where somebody will take it. I can't think of the name of that book a couple of years ago about being a shortstop. God, I read it. It was great. My brain is, do you know that, what I'm talking about, Joe? About 4 or 5 years ago, maybe.
Don't you have it behind you?
What's that? I'm sorry.
Don't you have it behind you somewhere?
No. Oh, don't. I was thinking, don't you have it behind you? No, that's not it. No, I don't. I'm sorry. But no. Yeah, but it was like close to the #1 bestseller, and it used baseball as its motif, and it was fiction, and it was terrific. So, yeah, it's still there, still is a thing. But when we're not playing it at all, maybe somebody will write about viruses based on and pandemics based on baseball.
Yeah, it's scary what's happening to the shrinking sports section. It took Roger Angel a long, long time to get to the Hall of Fame too, because he was never a member of the Baseball Writers Association, and he was never a beat guy or a press guy, but it finally got him in, and that was long overdue. Yeah, I can't speak to journalism certainly, since I'm not a journalist, but it seems to me that the blogosphere, which is not a new thing anymore, is going to factor, I think, in the future of at least baseball writing and sports writing in general, because, as Rick said, journalism and newspapers in particular, that industry is at this strange sort of precipice right now, this strange place. We don't know what the future is going to be. Blogging will always be around. And I think in a funny way, blogging allows the good writer the kind of space and a lack of deadline, soft deadlines, a lack of deadline anyway, that Roger enjoyed at the New Yorker. And so maybe there will be a future Roger Angel among us who will turn to the blog for his writing. There is a lot of great writing on the blog, a lot of great baseball writing on the blog now, a lot of great long form baseball writing in blogs now. And so that's a great thing to see. So that's probably going to be the future, I think. And I think baseball as a sport lends itself, as I mentioned earlier, to that kind of sort of long considered approach to thinking about the game that blogging, even though it's as instant as anything else right now, the actual process of writing, you can take your time and publish it when you want. So that will probably factor in the future.
Well, yeah, I would like to add to that, Joe, because that is everything. I'll give you an example. People have no idea how well somebody could write if they didn't have a deadline. Try writing 750 words and you've got 45 minutes and the clock is ticking. And if you don't push send at exactly that minute, there will be an ad there blocking, in the newspaper. So, and with noise going, leaf blowers, everything, whatever might be going on, a lot of people say, oh, I can do that. Yeah, sure. In your basement, sitting there calmly watching on your TV, you can't, but try being there. And I defy anybody to do that because it's not taught in journalism school. But, so I'm going to give you an example of the dreaded aspects of deadline writing, which were there for all newspaper writing. We're talking about everybody. Roger Angel, obviously, for a magazine, yeah, no problem. Go and rework it for another 2 days. But you can't do that in newspaper writing. Is that good or bad? I don't know, but that's how most people got their writing. Most people don't subscribe to the New Yorker. I do, but most people don't. By the way, the book was The Art of Fielding by Chad Harbach. It was the #1 bestseller. So that's what I was trying to think of. Sorry about that. Didn't think of it. I don't know if you've heard of it, but anyway, that was the book. So I'm at the World Series 2016. The Cubs have not won a World Series in 108 years. They're playing the Cleveland Indians in Cleveland. It's the 7th game of the World Series. There's a rain delay. The first deadline passes. Guess what? The score is tied. The biggest game in the last century plus, and you have to write a column, and you don't know who won the game. And that's all that matters. Are they World Series champions, or are they the Cubs, the lovable losers, one more time? And the second deadline is the clock is ticking. And here we go. The first one was at 9:30 or 10. Now we've got until 11:45 or midnight, the absolute last one to get anything out to all readers. And everybody wants a newspaper that documents a World Series championship. Because as I always say, well, you want to frame your laptop up on the wall? No, it doesn't work too well. So here's the clock going. It's still tied. And there's a rain delay, and the Cubs are at bat. And I had to flip a coin in my mind and make a ridiculous decision that the Cubs were going to win. And they did. And I was lucky by 5 minutes, but it didn't matter. It was, if I'd waited 5 more minutes, it would not have gotten in. That was the headline, the main story in the Sun-Times. People, I'm sure, have it on their walls. A great wraparound photo of the Cubs celebrating. And try doing that sometime, folks. That's 3 or 4 years off my life, at least. Miserable beyond belief. And
that's great.
Novel writers, do you remember that, Joe?
What's that?
That game?
Oh my God, do I remember? Of course. Incredible. Yeah. Oh my God. And that's a great story. And that story alone it illustrates how important print media is. You're right. You want to save that paper. You want to frame it, or you want to put it in a box down in the basement. And you can, printing an article off the web is not the same thing. So that alone is enough reason to let's keep print newspapers alive. That's a great story.
I can say that, Rick. My dad is a lifelong Cubs fan, one who definitely ran out to grab the newspapers to have in his house, to finally show that the Cubs won the World Series. So just listening to that brings me back to that night, and just funny to think about how maybe, if Ben Zobrist's ball is, not as close to the third base line as it was, we're one bad headline, one bad hop from a really bad headline. So thank you for that, bringing back good memories for me. Well, I want to say.
One other thing about that, Ben Zobrist, you brought up, interesting. He was the MVP of that game, and all of us there in the press box, if you could be there, you wouldn't want to be around, because tensions were incredibly high. Nobody was enjoying the game. I mean, it was, if I were just a plain old fan, oh my God, that would have been, I would have been walking around, I would have been nervous as hell, having a beer, would have had friends or whatever around, and it's going on. And, think of that, 7th game, rain delay, tie game, and extra innings. I mean, it's like
incredible.
And it's the Cubs.
Well, I might add to that. I mentioned, Rick, earlier, I don't know if you could hear that the Baseball Hall of Fame has all of Roger Angel's 60-plus boxes of his old manuscripts and box scores and game notes and everything. It's fantastic trove to research. One of the things I found in his game notes for the '86 World Series against the Mets and the Red Sox was that Angel, who of course is first and foremost a fan, and he says all sports writers are, even though they don't want to admit it necessarily. But that series was especially tough for him because he grew up a Red Sox fan because his mother was a Red Sox fan. She moved with her husband E.B. White up into New England and lived there, where of course they were Red Sox lifers. So he was a Red Sox fan, but at the same time he was I can't say lifelong Mets fan, but a Mets fan since they were born, 62, because they essentially replaced his New York Giants, which was his beloved team. So he was a Mets fan and a Red Sox fan, and never did he think he would see the two of them in a World Series. And so his game notes are fascinating to see him go back and forth as a fan while taking journalistic notes about the game, going back and forth. I want the Red Sox to win. No, I want the Mets to win. No, I want the Red Sox to win. It was a great thing to sort of see in his own kind of herky-jerky handwriting. So, yeah.
Well, listen, that part of it I can completely 100% identify with. And, one thing about being a sports writer as a career, you have fandom kind of beaten out of you on a daily basis because you can't afford it. You have to do your work. You might want to it sometimes, and I have, just stop and watch the game. But you got to keep typing. And one time I was typing away on a column, and a foul ball. It was at used to be U.S. Cellular. It was Comiskey, then U.S. Cellular. Now it's Guaranteed Rate Field. So this was when it was the Cell. And Chris Widger, the catcher for the White Sox, was at bat. No big deal, just a minor player. And I was typing, and he hit a foul ball, and it came up over the screen through the open window in the press box, and I saw it at the very last second as it cleared my laptop by about an inch, and I trapped it against my chest. It didn't even drop to the table. I mean, like, people were stunned, and I was stunned. It was really a great athletic move. But the next day and 2 days later, I had a perfectly circular purple, then black, then green, yellow bruise right there. And eventually, Widger, I gave the ball back to the PR guy. Widger signed it, and it was hilarious. He said, I don't know, it was something like, now I know why you were whatever the hell you were. But that's what happens all the time. You're not watching half the time because you're writing, for Christ's sake. And it's maddening. I would love to just watch the games, but can't do it.
Someday.
Yeah. Well, I hate to break up the discussion, but I do want to make sure that we do have enough Q&A time for our participants. I know we do have a couple questions for you guys. I'd like to remind our attendees as well, if you do have a question, if you would like to ask it live, to raise your hand and we will call on you. So, all right. So we'll first talk with Lauren. Lauren, you should be able to talk now.
Hi.
Hey, Lauren.
So you guys have talked about a lot of really great male writers, but the MLB fan base is 30% female and it's growing. And women are getting into the writing game too. Who are some of your favorite female baseball writers that you enjoy? And who do you see kind of becoming up and coming in the sport when it comes to writing?
I like Susan Slouser, I think, who writes out in California. I don't know that I can speak very knowledgeably or well about an up-and-coming female baseball writer. Rick?
Oh, okay. You can hear me now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Jane Levy wrote a great book about Mickey Mantle. There haven't been all that many female baseball writers. I got to tell you, and there've been some really good female sports writers. But part of the problem is if you're a beat writer, which I never was, but I watched them all in a kind of a state of awe and amazement and apology. I mean, like feeling sorry for them. You're on the road. You're gone. You live out of a suitcase. And, it's hard enough for guys, but a woman who wants to do that is kind of a rare apple. I mean, I would never have done it, never in a million years. Roger Kahn made it sound like a very glorious, glamorous lifestyle to follow the Brooklyn Dodgers. But if you think about it, you're flying commercial all the time. You're not flying on the jet with the players. Maybe they used to do that. They'd be on the same train or whatever. But it is a nightmare of travel, of bags, of trying to find out where you are. Your whole life is put on hold for at least 6 months. And then you go to spring training, which is nice, but you're again gone for 2 months. So, good luck having a family, things like that. It's tough. It's tough. I just want to say that.
Right. Next, we'll have a question from Jeff.
You can hear me now?
Yes, Jeff, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first to answer Lauren, Alex Coffey and Lindsay Adler at The Athletic are two younger female writers who are really excellent and write a lot of human interest stuff, particularly Alex, who are worth following. So that's that question. But my question's really more to Rick. You and Joe have both talked about why baseball galvanizes writers. But I'm curious why you think it galvanizes readers, because clearly the other sports, and Rick, you've written basketball, NCAA, lots of great stories and books about the other sports that have amazing historical moments as well as interesting characters. But readers and publishers alike are both not as interested in those stories. And I wonder why you think baseball appeals to readers more than football does or basketball does.
That's an interesting question. I'd have to think about that. One thing I know is that we always talk about fathers playing catch with sons, or fathers playing catch with daughters now, or uncles or cousins or whatever. Baseball, there's so many games that you can always say, hey, Junior, let's go to a game. And you pick a date, virtually any date, any team you want. If you live anywhere near a big city, you don't even have to live near one. You say, let's go to Kansas City. Let's watch the Royals play the Yankees or the A's. Let's do that. And then you make a trip. I did that with my dad. And I think a lot of people did that either with their fathers or whatever. And the other big thing, everybody on this planet has, I believe, has played baseball or softball or catch or batted a ball at some point. Women, girls, boys, men, old geezers, everybody has done it. We all know the game. I mean, in America, you know what baseball is. You throw, you catch, you run. So I think that commonality is something. A lot of people haven't played hardcore tackle football. Very few people have played hockey. Basketball, yeah, a lot of people know that. But again, that's more of an action athletic game. There's just a lot of times in baseball for digression and looking around you. And I think, that's just my off-the-cuff kind of response.
Rick, it's interesting. I wonder if you think because so many more kids now are growing up playing soccer than playing baseball, do you think that that's going to have a similar effect for readers of writing about soccer, I wonder? That sense of commonality that you mentioned?
Probably. But, again, kids don't go out and kick a ball around with their dad. I mean, maybe they do a little more. Soccer has been guaranteed to be the sport of America for at least the last 50 to 60 years. Yeah. I know that because I remember books from way back, like when I was in college, that are saying, here comes soccer, watch out. And it still hasn't taken over. It's a great sport. Nothing against it, but Americans grew up using their hands. And, that's just weird. The foot thing, it's going to take a while. I think, and I don't believe it would ever, in my opinion, ever replace baseball. I mean, certainly as a trope or whatever, as a theme, as something to write about. I just don't.
Thank you both. We'll go over to next, Jeff.
Hi.
Jeff.
There's two Jeffs out there, so I didn't know which one you were working on. I had a question for Joe. Jeff squared. Joe, during the course of interviewing Roger Ansel for your book, did you have occasion to actually watch a baseball game with him?
Sadly, no. Roger himself has been finding it difficult to get to games lately, given his age and other factors and circumstances. So unfortunately, all of our conversations were via phone. And I one of the things I would have loved to have done was to sit with him in the press box, or even better yet, in the stands. But no, it didn't happen, unfortunately.
Yeah. I was wondering what that experience might have been like, but unfortunately, it didn't happen.
Well, I interviewed David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker, and he said not the one game, but the first game he attended with Roger Angel was the greatest event in his life outside of his family. I can imagine.
Hey, Joe, I just got to say, as an aside here, you interviewed David Remnick. Could anybody in this country despise our president more than him? I chuckle every time I read one of his columns in his own magazine.
Yes, and we had one or two asides in our conversation about Trump. So yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, sorry, didn't mean to bring that up. One other quick question: how old? I missed the early part. How old is Roger Angel? He's still with us, right?
He will be 100 in September.
Oh.
Thank you both. Right, next we'll talk to Mitch.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for participating in this tonight. It's been really interesting. I think Rick hit the nail on the head describing the best baseball writing as having a lyrical component. One of my favorite baseball books was Babe, The Legend Comes to Life by Robert Creamer, who I think was an editor at Sports Illustrated at one point.
Yes, he was my editor for a while. Yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I just love that book. Do you think one of the aspects that distinguishes baseball writing is the feeling that the present connects to the distant past in a way that other sports might not? You don't seem to hear about Red Grange like you do about Babe Ruth.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'll let Joe handle that. Joe.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, 100 years from now, let's say all the major sports are still going. And by that point, hockey, basketball, football will have, very, very, very long and rich history. So you very well might see that kind of, Courtney and I were talking earlier about the generational quality of baseball. But Babe Ruth was a different thing all entirely. He was a folk hero. He was an enormously popular person, a popular figure, a celebrity, really. Red Grange wasn't. So part of the appeal in that case is that Babe Ruth was such a popular figure. But there was a time for many decades until the 60s, basically, when baseball was the number one sport in America. It was generally everyone's favorite sport. Rick mentioned families growing up playing it in the way that they didn't play football or start shooting hoops until the 60s and the 70s. So that aspect of the game has always been part of it. I don't know if it's diminishing or not, but there is, you're right, Mitch, that part of what's appealing about baseball is, I don't know if it's unique it isn't unique to baseball. I was going to say the fact that grandfathers and sons and then grandchildren take in games together. You see that happening in other sports, but it does seem to be part of the myth of baseball. Why, I'm not quite so sure.
Thank you again. All right, next we'll go over to Michael.
I have one question for, hello?
Hi.
Michael.
I have one question
Hello.
for both guys. Is there going to be a baseball season this year? And if not, what a damage that will be to the overall game for a long time.
Oh my God! I mean, if you saw Rob Manfred last night, I mean, if you saw these guys, the baseball thing. First of all, to answer your question, it upsets me. But first of all, yes, they will play at some point. I absolutely can't imagine them not playing at all during the summer. This is baseball season, by the way. The NBA is going to restart, and pro golf has started, and the NFL says they're going to start. These baseball people just keep demolishing everybody's feelings by making all these issues over money. I mean, of course it's money. Just solve it somehow. Play the game. These players, it's the only thing in this world they can do better than anybody else, and that's play baseball. And you don't play, well then, God help you. And the owners, just another tip, you can't take it with you. I know a lot of guys who died with a lot of money, and as far as I know, they're not spending it somewhere else. So somehow they should do it. And if they don't, if there's no baseball season, the disgust, at least mine, will never end.
I'm less confident than Rick is that there'll be a season, in part because you have to factor in the pandemic to it, and players are testing positive, and I don't think they've come to any kind of real firm understanding of what the best way is to avoid spikes in cases among players and umpires, et cetera. But I know the owners want a season. I think they'd be happy with one weekend of a season, some sort of like round robin or maybe a couple weeks NCAA style or something. As long as they get a postseason and they get that money from the postseason, I think the owners and Manfred will be happy. Of course, the players want to play, but I think at this point, a 50-game season is ridiculous. And I think that, in the end, might do more damage to baseball's integrity than canceling the season outright, if the owners can and the players can make the case that, well, it's also because of the pandemic and that's out of our hands, so the best thing to do is cancel the season. Whether or not they'll do that, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would add the special that was on ESPN last night. This has nothing to do with the pandemic. It has everything to do with collective bargaining, with money, with how we distribute the wages. This is 100% about money. It has nothing to do with the danger. Listen, you're worried about COVID, and you're going to play football, and you're lining up against a guy, and you're breathing on him, and down there in the pit, or you're playing basketball, and you're guarding a guy, and you're up so close to him. I mean, those are the guys who should worry about, who are worried about the disease. Baseball is the one sport where, in general, you're far apart. So this is just greed. This is just mercenary. Has nothing to do with the health issue right now.
I couldn't agree more. No.
And finally, we'll go over toward Bob.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. All right. I'm a coordinator at the OLLI program at Northwestern University. That's for old guys like me and women that like to talk about baseball. And we have the class called The Literature of Baseball, where each semester we choose a different book. by far and away nonfiction, to talk about the game and the writing. And we did choose The Summer Game by Roger Angell. And a semester we went through that. And I was wondering, Joe, in your discussions, or maybe Rick would know as well, what writer or writers does Roger Angell like to read about baseball? And that could be either nonfiction or fiction.
I'm not quite sure what Roger's taste in baseball fiction is. He hasn't written a whole lot about it, but I know that the one writer who he has enjoyed his whole life, really, and that he cites as one of his major influences was a writer I mentioned earlier, and that's Red Smith, who wrote about baseball in small papers eventually, starting in Milwaukee, I think, in the mid-century, and eventually by the 70s was syndicated in the hundreds of newspapers around the world. Won the Pulitzer finally. Red Smith was a real influence on Roger, and he cites him to this day as one of his favorite writers. I mentioned a little bit earlier, in part because Smith wrote about baseball players, and also at the time, which was rare, owners and even umpires, in such a way that treated them as human beings, as imperfect human beings. And he was funny, but he was very wryly funny, and he was very skeptical. So Red Smith is a writer who Roger has long enjoyed. I mean, was very, very happy to. One of the reasons he was happy to be the Hall of Fame a few years back was because his old friend and mentor, or mentor, I should say, Red Smith was also in the Hall of Fame. So that was really nice for Roger to be in the same room with him as we were. He's also cited John Updike's famous piece about Ted Williams' final game, which ran in the New Yorker in 1960, I think, as not only one of the influential pieces on him, but one of Roger's favorite pieces about baseball in general. So if you don't know Updike's piece on Williams' last game, that's a classic.
Joe, did you say he ran in 1950?
Red Smith? He was...
Well, yeah, the story, I thought you said about Ted Williams.
Oh, 1960.
60, okay. Well, that's only 60 years ago.
Yeah, maybe 61, I'm not sure.
Well, that's about the time that we have for tonight's event. I want to thank again Joe Bonomo and Bonomo. Excuse me, did I say it correctly?
You did, thanks.
To say, as someone who gets their last name, but I'm always sensitive to that. But thank you, Joe, and thank you to Rick Telander for joining us. We want to thank you again for all our attendees who have come. Have a good evening, everyone.